The summer of 1981 brought relentless heat to the small coastal town of Bayview, Oregon, located just off Highway 101. This sleepy community typically saw a steady stream of vacationers between Memorial Day and Labor Day, its population nearly tripling during those precious summer months before returning to its quiet off-season rhythm of just under 2. Among those summer visitors were the Chambers family, Thomas, 38, his wife Eleanor, 36, and their 3 children, Michael, 14, Stephanie, 12, and Daniel, 9. For the Chambers, this trip represented a long-anticipated escape from their daily routines in Fresno, California, where Thomas worked as an insurance adjuster and Eleanor taught 4th grade at Westlake Elementary. The Pacific Northwest vacation had been meticulously planned for months. Friends and neighbors later recalled how Eleanor had spread maps across their dining room table, marking scenic spots with colored pins and creating an itinerary that would take them from the redwoods of Northern California up through Oregon's coastline, eventually ending at Olympic National Park in Washington. What no one could have predicted was that the Chambers family would never complete their journey. On July 17, 1981, they checked into the Oceanview Motel in Bayview. By the following morning, all 5 members of the family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nearly all of their possessions in room 8 of the modest roadside establishment. It was as if they'd simply stepped out for breakfast and were expected back any minute, recalls former Bayview Police Chief Dennis Holloway, who was a young patrol officer when the case first opened. Their suitcases were still unpacked, toothbrushes still damp in the bathroom, and a paperback novel lay open on one of the beds. Thomas's wallet was found in the nightstand drawer, containing 2040 $40 in cash and all his identification. Eleanor's purse was on the dresser with her driver's license inside. The only things missing were the clothes they were presumably wearing and, strangely, the family's Kodak camera. The family's dark blue 1978 Ford LTD station wagon remained parked directly in front of their room, keys still in the ignition. Inside the vehicle, maps were neatly folded in the glove compartment, and a cooler in the back contained unopened cans of soda and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper provisions for the next leg of their journey. The disappearance made front-page news throughout the Pacific Northwest. Newspapers from Portland to Seattle carried the baffling story, showing school photos of the 3 Chambers children alongside a vacation snapshot of Thomas and Eleanor, standing arm in arm at Crater Lake, taken just days before their disappearance. The headline in the Bayview Sentinel read, "Family of 5 vanishes from local motel, no signs of foul play." In those initial days, theories abounded. Perhaps the family had gone for a pre-dawn beach walk and been swept away by a rogue wave, a known danger on Oregon's treacherous coastline. Others speculated they might have encountered trouble while hiking the nearby cliffside trails. Search and rescue teams combed the beaches, forests, and cliffs surrounding Bayview, but no trace of the Chambers family was found. The lack of signs of struggle in room 8 initially led investigators to consider the possibility that the family had left willingly, perhaps with someone they knew. Yet the abandoned car and belongings contradicted this theory. Who would leave behind their identification, money, and vehicle? And if they had decided to depart suddenly, why not check out properly? The motel registry showed they had paid for 3 nights in advance. We interviewed every guest staying at the Oceanview that night, as well as all staff members, says Holloway. Nobody reported hearing unusual sounds or seeing the family after approximately 9:30 p.m., when the motel manager observed Thomas and Eleanor sitting in plastic chairs outside their room, watching the sunset while the children played a board game on the concrete walkway. Melvin Gunderson, the night manager of the motel in 1981, was the last known person to see the family. In his police statement, he described a perfectly ordinary encounter. Mr. Chambers stopped by the office around 9 to ask if we had extra towels. He mentioned they'd spent the day at the beach, and the kids had used all the towels. He was friendly, seemed relaxed. Nothing about his behavior suggested anything was wrong or that he was under any kind of stress. As days turned into weeks without answers, the investigation took a darker turn. Detectives began looking more closely at the family's background, searching for hidden troubles that might explain their sudden disappearance. Back in Fresno, colleagues and neighbors expressed disbelief. The Chambers were described universally as a close-knit, stable family. Thomas's supervisor at California Mutual Insurance noted that Thomas had recently received a promotion and seemed in good spirits before leaving on vacation. Eleanor's fellow teachers described her as a devoted mother and dedicated educator who had been excited about the summer road trip, even incorporating aspects of their planned route into geography lessons for her students. The children, too, left behind no obvious signs of distress. Michael was an honor roll student and played trumpet in the school band. Stephanie had recently won a regional spelling bee. Daniel, the youngest, was described as a quiet but happy child who collected baseball cards and had just learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels earlier that summer. Bank records showed no unusual withdrawals or financial troubles. The mortgage on their modest Fresno home was current. There were no life insurance policies with suspiciously large payouts. The family had no known enemies, and both Thomas and Eleanor came from small families with whom they maintained good relationships. Yet as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered one curious detail. 3 weeks before the vacation, Thomas had placed a long-distance call to Bayview, Oregon. The call lasted approximately 12 minutes, but the number he dialed belonged to a public payphone located outside a convenience store near the harbor. There was no way to determine who, if anyone, had answered that call. When questioned, none of Thomas's colleagues or friends could explain why he would have called a payphone in a town where they supposedly had no connections. This discovery raised the first serious questions about whether the Chambers' presence in Bayview might not have been the random stop of tourists after all, but rather a deliberately planned destination. The case took another turn in early August of 1981, when a commercial fisherman found a child's tennis shoe washing against the pylons of the Bayview Pier. The blue canvas sneaker with white rubber trim was identified as belonging to Daniel Chambers by the boy's grandmother, who recognized a distinctive dinosaur drawing the child had made on the inside sole with permanent marker. The shoe showed no signs of blood or damage, but its discovery at the water's edge inevitably steered the investigation toward the possibility that the family had somehow ended up in the ocean. For 3 days, the Coast Guard conducted extensive searches of the bay and nearby coastal waters. Divers explored underwater caves and recesses in the rocky shoreline. The search yielded nothing more, no additional items of clothing, no bodies, no further clues. By September, the case had reached an impasse. With no definitive evidence of foul play and no bodies, the disappearance remained classified as a missing persons case rather than a homicide investigation. Yet few in law enforcement believed the family had disappeared voluntarily. The fact that they left behind virtually all of their possessions, including their vehicle and their money, that tells me something happened to them that night, Holloway states. Whether they were coerced, whether they were taken, or whether they walked away willingly to meet someone and then encountered trouble. Those were the questions that kept us up at night. As months stretched into years, the Chambers case gradually faded from headlines, joining the ranks of America's enduring mysteries. Their home in Fresno was eventually sold by Eleanor's sister, who had been granted temporary custody of the property after the family was legally declared missing. The proceeds were placed in a trust in the event any family members ever returned or were found. The Oceanview Motel continued operating, though local law claimed Room 8 was haunted. Some guests reported hearing the sounds of children playing or feeling a cold spot near the bathroom door. The motel owners neither encouraged nor discouraged these stories, but they did quietly renumber the rooms in 1986, transforming the notorious Room 8 into Room 10, perhaps hoping to disassociate from the mystery that had brought their establishment unwanted attention. For 16 years, the case lay dormant, with occasional reviews yielding no new leads. Then, in November 1997, a startling development broke the silence. Jeffrey Walsh, a 34-year-old drifter with a lengthy criminal record, was arrested in Tucson, Arizona, on charges of armed robbery. During his interrogation, Walsh made a shocking claim. He had information about that family that disappeared up in Oregon back in the 80s. According to Walsh, during a stint in Nevada State Prison in 1995, his cellmate, a man named Vincent Keller, had confessed to killing the Chambers family. Detectives from the Oregon State Police flew to Arizona to interview Walsh. His statement, recorded on November 12, 1997, opened new avenues of investigation, but ultimately raised more questions than it answered. Walsh claimed that Keller, who was serving time for aggravated assault, had boasted about murdering a family in coastal Oregon many years earlier. According to Walsh's account, Keller had been running a small-time drug smuggling operation, using fishing boats to transport marijuana up from Mexico along the Pacific coast. Thomas Chambers had supposedly witnessed something he shouldn't have while taking photographs near the Bayview harbor, and Keller determined the entire family needed to be eliminated. The way Keller told it, Walsh stated in his recorded interview, he and two other guys forced their way into the family's motel room late at night. They marched them out at gunpoint, through the back window to avoid being seen from the parking lot, took them to a boat, weighted them down and dumped them miles offshore. Keller said the dad begged for his kids' lives, offered money, said he wouldn't tell anyone what he saw. But Keller didn't trust that. He said, "No witnesses, no case." That's how he always put it. Walsh's story contained enough specific details to warrant investigation, but there were problems with his account. Vincent Keller, the alleged confessor, had died in prison in 1996 from complications of hepatitis C, making it impossible to confirm or deny Walsh's claims. Moreover, extensive background checks failed to connect Keller to Bayview in any meaningful way. Though he had prior convictions for drug trafficking, they involved operations in Southern California, not Oregon. Most problematically, Walsh's credibility was questionable at best. He had a history of offering information to authorities in exchange for leniency, and most of his previous tips had proven to be fabrications. When pressed on specific details about the Chambers case, his answers became vague and inconsistent. After months of investigation, detectives concluded that Walsh's story was likely another of his calculated fictions, designed to gain favorable treatment in his own case. The apparent lead evaporated, and the Chambers mystery returned to the cold case files. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, advancements in forensic science prompted reviews of evidence from numerous cold cases nationwide. In 2003, investigators re-examined the limited physical evidence from the Chambers disappearance, including fingerprints from room 8, by then room 10 of the Oceanview Motel. While most prints matched those of the family or had been identified as belonging to motel staff and subsequent guests, 3 unidentified partial fingerprints remained. These prints were uploaded to the newly expanded National Fingerprint Database, but no matches were found. DNA analysis was performed on strands of hair found in the shower drain, preserved in the original evidence collection, but again, all identifiable samples matched the Chambers family members, based on DNA later obtained from items at their Fresno home. By the new millennium, the Oceanview Motel had changed ownership twice. In 2005, the aging structure was purchased by a development company with plans to demolish it and build a more upscale boutique hotel in its place. Before demolition began, the company allowed the Bayview Historical Society to document the old motel, photographing each room for the town's archives. During this documentation process, volunteer photographer Harriet Fleming noticed something unusual about room 10, formerly room 8. The dimensions of the bathroom appeared slightly smaller than those in other rooms, suggesting there might be a gap between the bathroom walls and the exterior wall of the building. "I mentioned it to the project manager," Fleming recalled in a 2013 interview with Oregon Coast magazine. He said these old buildings often had quirks like that, spaces where plumbing or electrical wiring ran, or just construction oddities from the days before standardized building codes. "I thought nothing more of it until years later, when they found what was hidden inside that wall." The demolition of the Oceanview Motel began in October 2005. 3 days into the project, construction worker Miguel Fuentes was removing drywall from room 10 when his sledgehammer broke through into a narrow cavity between walls. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag and nestled amid decades of dust, was a Kodak Instamatic camera, the same model that had been noted as missing from the Chambers family's possessions. Police were immediately called to the scene. The camera, its film still inside, was carefully extracted from its hiding place and taken into evidence. The circumstances were suspicious enough to halt demolition temporarily, while investigators examined the site more thoroughly. No additional evidence was found in the wall cavity or elsewhere in the room. The discovery of the camera, potentially the Chambers' missing camera, after 24 years reignited interest in the case. The film was carefully removed from the device and sent to a specialized FBI photo laboratory for development, a delicate process given the film's age and condition. What the developed photographs would reveal, however, would cast the mystery in an entirely new light and send investigators down paths they had never anticipated when the case began. The 12 exposures on that roll of film would transform understanding of what might have happened to the Chambers family and why they had vanished so completely, leaving almost everything behind but taking their camera. The photographs initially seemed ordinary enough, typical vacation snapshots of the family visiting landmarks along their journey. The first 7 frames showed scenes from earlier in their trip, the children standing beside massive redwood trees. Eleanor and Thomas posed at the Oregon dunes, Michael and Stephanie holding ice cream cones in what appeared to be a small town square, Daniel feeding seagulls on a beach, and the whole family arranged in front of their station wagon at a scenic overlook, taken with the camera's self-timer. But it was the 8th photograph that caught investigators' attention. The image showed what appeared to be Bayview Harbor at dusk, taken from a hillside vantage point overlooking the marina. In the frame, a small fishing boat could be seen tied at the farthest dock. Though somewhat blurry, the image captured 3 men unloading large, rectangular packages from the vessel. The 9th frame was similar but taken from a slightly different angle, as if the photographer had moved to get a better view. This image was clearer, showing the men more distinctly as they transferred what resembled wrapped bales from the boat to the back of a pickup truck. One man appeared to be looking up in the direction of the camera, his face partially visible. The 10th frame was dramatically different, a blurred, chaotic shot of dark ground and what might have been running feet, as if taken accidentally while the photographer was in motion. The 11th exposure was completely black, showing nothing at all. The 12th and final frame on the roll was the most disturbing. Taken in what appeared to be low light, possibly with a flash, it showed a close-up of a motel room door, with the number 8 clearly visible. The image was tilted at an odd angle, and a dark shape that could have been a person's shoulder or back was partially visible at the edge of the frame. Looking at those last few photographs, the story began to write itself, says retired Detective Carl Matthews, who was assigned to the reopened case in 2005. It appeared that Thomas Chambers had inadvertently photographed some kind of drug smuggling operation at the harbor. Based on the sequence, he might have been spotted by the smugglers, fled, and returned to the motel. The final picture suggests someone may have followed him back. The discovery of the camera and its contents transformed the investigation from a baffling disappearance to a likely homicide case, with a clear motive. If Thomas had witnessed and photographed illegal activity, then hidden the camera in the motel room wall, presumably to preserve evidence while protecting his family, it would explain why the Chambers had been targeted. Using advanced photo enhancement techniques, unavailable in 1981, FBI analysts worked to identify the men captured in the harbor photographs. The image quality, combined with the passage of time, made positive identification challenging, but one face was clear enough to run through facial recognition databases. In April 2006, that analysis produced a match. Raymond Holt, a known associate of a drug trafficking organization that had operated along the West Coast during the late 1970s and early Holt had been killed in a shootout with DEA agents in 1984, near the California-Mexico border, but his involvement linked the Chambers case to a specific criminal enterprise known to have been active in the Bayview area during the summer of 19. This connection finally explained the mysterious phone call Thomas had made to the Bayview payphone weeks before their trip. Investigators now theorized that Thomas might have had some prior knowledge of illegal activities in the area, perhaps through his work as an insurance adjuster, or through some other chance encounter or information that had reached him in Fresno. The call to the payphone suggested a planned meeting with an informant or contact rather than a random discovery while on vacation. We believe Thomas Chambers may have been working as an informant, either officially or unofficially, Matthews explains. His trip to Bayview might have been dual-purpose, a family vacation that also allowed him to gather evidence about this smuggling operation. If that's the case, it would explain why the family specifically included Bayview on their itinerary, despite it not being one of the more notable tourist destinations on the Oregon coast. Yet this theory, while compelling, opened another troubling question. If Thomas had prior knowledge of criminal activity in Bayview, why would he bring his family into potential danger? No evidence has ever emerged that he had any formal connection to law enforcement or was working as a registered informant. If he had stumbled onto information about drug trafficking and taken it upon himself to gather evidence, he had made a catastrophic miscalculation about the risks involved. The investigation shifted to tracking down surviving members of the drug organization, identified through Raymond Holt. Several former associates were located, some in prison, others having served their sentences and returned to civilian life. Each denied any knowledge of or involvement in the disappearance of the Chambers family, and without physical evidence linking them directly to the case, no arrests could be made. By 2010, the statute of limitations had long expired on any drug trafficking charges from that era, but there is no statute of limitations on murder. The case remained open, with investigators still hoping to gather enough evidence to bring charges against anyone who might have been involved in what they now firmly believed was the murder of 5 innocent people. In 2013, the site where the Oceanview Motel once stood finally completed its transformation into the Bayview Boutique Hotel, an upscale establishment catering to wealthy tourists seeking a quiet coastal getaway. Nothing in the hotel's sleek design or marketing materials hints at the property's connection to one of Oregon's most enduring mysteries, though local tour guides often include the story in their narratives about the town. For decades, the beaches and waters around Bayview have been searched periodically for remains, but the deep offshore trenches and strong currents of the Pacific Northwest coastline make it unlikely that bodies weighted and dumped at sea would ever be recovered. As the investigation moved into its 4th decade, those with first-hand knowledge of the case gradually retired or passed away. Officer Holloway, by then long retired as police chief, died in. Melvin Gunderson, the night manager who last saw the Chambers family, had succumbed to cancer in 2002, never knowing that the camera would eventually be found hidden in the wall of room A. Of the original investigators, only Detective Matthews remained actively interested in the case, continuing to review files and follow up on occasional tips, even in retirement. His home office walls are lined with photographs, timelines, and maps related to the Chambers family's final journey. Some cases just stay with you, Matthews says. This one with 3 children involved. I have never been able to let it go. Those kids would be in their 50s now if they'd lived. They might have had children of their own, grandchildren even. An entire future was stolen that night. For years, the case seemed to have reached its conclusion, a family in the wrong place at the wrong time. Witnesses to a crime who paid the ultimate price for what they saw. The camera in the wall had provided answers about why the Chambers were likely targeted, but offered little hope of ever bringing those responsible to justice after so much time had passed. Then, in the summer of 2024, 43 years after the Chambers family vanished, a call came into the Bayview Police Department that would breathe new life into the investigation. The caller, an elderly man speaking in a raspy voice weakened by illness, claimed to have information about what really happened that night in 1981, information that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the case. The call came on a Tuesday morning in July 2024, routed to Detective Laura Nichols, who had inherited the Chambers case when Detective Matthews finally fully retired. The caller identified himself as Howard Mercer, a 79-year-old former Bayview resident, now living in a hospice facility in Boise, Idaho. "I don't have much time left," Mercer told Nichols, his voice betraying the ravages of late-stage lung cancer. "There are things I need to get right with God before I go. Things about that family that disappeared from the Oceanview back in..." Nichols, who had spent countless hours studying the Chambers case files since taking over the investigation, immediately began recording the call. Over the next 47 minutes, Howard Mercer provided an account that would upend decades of theories about what had happened to Thomas, Eleanor, and their 3 children. According to Mercer, he had been working as a maintenance man at the Oceanview Motel during the summer of 1981. He claimed that on the night of July 17, around 11:30 p.m., he had observed Thomas Chambers hurriedly ushering his family from their room to their station wagon. Mercer, who had been replacing light bulbs along the exterior walkway, said he ducked around the corner to avoid being seen, sensing something unusual about the family's behavior. "They were moving fast, real quiet-like," Mercer stated in his recorded testimony. The wife looked scared. The kids were still in their pajamas. Mr. Chambers kept looking over his shoulder, like he was worried someone was watching. They all piled into that station wagon, and he drove off with the headlights off until he reached the highway. This sighting, never before reported in the 43 years since the disappearance, directly contradicted the established narrative that the family had vanished from their room, presumably taken by force. If Mercer was telling the truth, the Chambers had fled the motel voluntarily and their car had not been left behind after all. "I should have come forward back then," Mercer continued. "But I had my own troubles with the law. I was on parole, wasn't supposed to be working nights. If I'd gotten involved, I'd have been violated and sent back to prison, so I kept my mouth shut. When I came to work the next day and heard they were missing, I figured they'd just run off somewhere. It wasn't until later, when the police were saying they'd disappeared from the room and the car was still there, that I realized something didn't add up." Detective Nichols pressed for details, particularly about the station wagon, which had been a critical piece of evidence in the original investigation. According to all official reports and photographs from the scene, the Chambers Blue Ford Ltd was parked outside room 8 when the family's disappearance was discovered. Mercer was adamant. "They drove away in that car. I swear on my mother's grave, I watched them go." If Mercer was correct, someone would have had to return the vehicle to the motel parking lot sometime between the family's departure and the following morning, when the motel manager, concerned that the guests hadn't checked out on time, entered the room and discovered their belongings still there. This revelation prompted an immediate review of the original crime scene photographs and evidence. In particular, investigators re-examined images of the station wagon and its contents. The keys found in the ignition were sent for modern DNA testing, as were various surfaces inside the vehicle that might have preserved fingerprints or genetic material from whoever had last driven it. Within days, Detective Nichols and a team from the Oregon State Police flew to Boise to interview Howard Mercer in person, bringing along case files and photographs to test the veracity of his claims. The elderly man, frail and tethered to an oxygen tank, nonetheless displayed remarkable lucidity as he provided additional details about that night in July. Most significantly, Mercer claimed he had overheard a heated conversation earlier in the evening between Thomas Chambers and an unidentified man in the motel parking lot. Though he couldn't make out specific words, the exchange had appeared tense, with Chambers repeatedly shaking his head and the stranger gesturing emphatically. "The guy wasn't one of the regular motel guests," Mercer recalled. "Drove a dark-colored pickup, maybe green or blue, hard to tell in the lot lighting. White guy, maybe 40-ish, wearing a baseball cap. I remember thinking he looked like he worked on boats or outdoors, had that weathered look, you know." They talked for maybe 5 minutes, then the guy left. Chambers went back into his room looking worried. This encounter, occurring approximately 2 hours before Mercer claimed to have seen the family fleeing, aligned with the theory that Thomas had somehow become entangled with the drug smugglers he had photographed. However, it introduced a new possibility. Perhaps instead of being abducted, the family had been warned and attempted to escape. Mercer's account, while compelling, presented investigators with a troubling contradiction to the established evidence. The station wagon indisputably had been found in the motel parking lot. Photographs taken by the first officers on the scene clearly showed the vehicle parked outside room 8. Either Mercer was mistaken or lying about seeing the family drive away, or someone had returned the car to create the impression that the Chambers had vanished while at the motel. Given Mercer's advanced age and the decades that had passed, investigators considered the possibility that his memory had conflated events or created false recollections. Yet his description of the motel's layout, the family's appearance, and other details from that night matched known facts with remarkable precision. Sometimes the mind plays tricks as we get older, Nichols acknowledges. But Mr. Mercer provided specific details that weren't included in news reports or publicly available information. He described the pattern on the pajamas Daniel Chambers was wearing, that night blue with small red sailboats. That detail was in the original missing persons report but never released to the media. To further evaluate Mercer's credibility, investigators sought to verify his employment at the Oceanview Motel in 1981. This proved challenging, as the motel's ownership had changed hands multiple times before its demolition, and employment records from that era had long since been discarded. However, a search of Oregon Department of Corrections records confirmed that Howard Mercer had indeed been on parole in Lincoln County during the summer of 1981, having served 18 months for burglary before his release in March of that year. Investigators also located Diane Westbrook, the daughter of the Oceanview's original owners, now living in Florida. In a telephone interview, she vaguely recalled a maintenance man named Howard, or Harold, who worked at the motel during her high school years, though she couldn't pinpoint the exact time frame of his employment. As Mercer's health rapidly declined, Detective Nichols arranged for a formal deposition to be taken at the hospice facility, creating a legally admissible record of his testimony. During this 4-hour session, Mercer expanded on his account, adding a crucial detail he claimed had only recently resurfaced in his memory. The day after they disappeared, when everyone was looking for that family, I was fixing a leaky faucet in room 12, Mercer stated. I overheard Melvin, he was the night manager, on the phone in the office. The wall between the office and room 12 was thin, and the AC vent carried sound. He said something like, "It's done. They are gone. The car's back where it should be." Then he said, "No, nobody saw nothing." I didn't think much of it at the time, but later I wondered if Melvin had something to do with it all. This allegation cast suspicion on Melvin Gunderson, the night manager who had been the last person known to have seen the Chambers family. In the original investigation, Gunderson had been questioned extensively, but never considered a suspect. He had provided Thomas Chambers with extra towels around 9 p.m., described the family as appearing normal and relaxed, and reported nothing unusual about their behavior or demeanor. With Gunderson having died in 2002, directly investigating Mercer's claims about his possible involvement became impossible. However, investigators began a thorough background check into Gunderson's life before and after the Chambers' disappearance, looking for any connections to the drug trafficking organization identified through the photographs or any sudden unexplained wealth that might suggest payment for criminal involvement. 2 weeks after his deposition, Howard Mercer died peacefully in his sleep, taking to his grave any additional information he might have possessed about that fateful night. His testimony, however, had irrevocably altered the direction of the investigation. Whether or not every detail of Mercer's account is accurate, his statement forced us to re-examine assumptions that had guided this case for over 4 decades, says Nichols. The possibility that the family fled voluntarily, at least initially, opens entirely new avenues of investigation. One such avenue led detectives to re-examine the mysterious phone call Thomas Chambers had made to the Bayview payphone 3 weeks before their vacation. Previously, this had been interpreted as Thomas potentially arranging a meeting with an informant related to the drug smuggling operation. Now, investigators considered an alternative. What if Thomas had been the one being called rather than the caller? Phone records from 1981 showed only that a call had been placed from the Chambers home in Fresno to the Bayview payphone, but not who had initiated the conversation. If someone had called the Chambers home first and asked Thomas to call them back at the payphone, a common practice in the era before cell phones, when trying to avoid long-distance charges, it would suggest that Thomas might have been contacted by someone in Bayview rather than reaching out himself. This subtle distinction carried significant implications. Rather than Thomas deliberately inserting himself and his family into a dangerous situation, he might have been unwittingly drawn into it. Perhaps he had been mistaken for someone else, or had knowledge he didn't realize was valuable or dangerous until that vacation brought him face to face with the consequences. To explore this possibility, investigators delved deeper into Thomas Chambers' professional life as an insurance adjuster. They discovered that in early 1981, he had handled several claims related to cargo losses from shipping companies operating along the West Coast. One case involved a small freight company that reported water damage to electronics being transported from Seattle to San Diego when their truck allegedly drove off the road during a coastal storm. Thomas had initially approved the claim, but later flagged it for further review after finding discrepancies in the driver's account and the damage patterns. The insurance company ultimately denied payment, citing evidence that suggested the electronics had been damaged before being loaded onto the truck, possibly during a transfer from another vehicle or vessel. The freight company, Coastal Express Shipping, had gone out of business shortly afterward. When investigators researched its ownership, they discovered it had been incorporated by a man named Lloyd Weber, who had peripheral connections to the same drug trafficking network linked to Raymond Holt, the man identified in the harbor photographs. "We began to see the outlines of a potential scenario," explains Nichols. Thomas Chambers may have unknowingly interfered with a business that was being used as a front for drug smuggling. By denying their fraudulent insurance claim, he cost them money and created a paper trail that could potentially lead back to their operation. If this theory was correct, the smugglers might have identified Thomas as a threat months before the family vacation. The call to the Bayview payphone could have been Thomas being lured into a meeting under false pretenses, perhaps being told that his presence was needed to inspect another insurance claim, or being offered information about the previous case. This would explain why the family included Bayview on their itinerary, despite it not being a major tourist destination. Thomas might have planned to handle a quick business matter while there, never suspecting the danger it posed. The photographs of the harbor activity would then represent not a deliberate attempt to gather evidence, but rather an unfortunate coincidence, Thomas happening to capture illegal activity while taking scenic vacation pictures, unaware of its significance until someone confronted him about it later that evening. The man Mercer had observed arguing with Thomas in the parking lot might have been sent to threaten him, warn him, or perhaps offer him money to turn over the camera and forget what he had seen. If Thomas refused and later realized the danger to his family, it would explain their hasty nighttime departure in their pajamas. But what happened after they drove away from the Oceanview Motel? And who returned their car to create the illusion that they had vanished from their room? The DNA analysis of the station wagon's steering wheel and keys provided a crucial breakthrough. Among the expected profiles matching the Chambers family members, technicians identified genetic material from an unknown male. When run through expanded modern databases, this DNA returned a familial match to a man named Lloyd Weber, the son of Lloyd Weber, who had owned the suspicious freight company. Lloyd Weber, now 67, was located living in a small town near Sacramento, California. When interviewed by FBI agents in August 2024, He initially denied any knowledge of the Chambers case or ever having been to Bayview. However, when confronted with the DNA evidence placing him in their vehicle, his demeanor changed. "I was just the driver," Weber finally admitted after hours of questioning. "I didn't know they were going to kill anybody. They told me it was just going to be a scare tactic, to teach the guy a lesson for taking pictures he shouldn't have." According to Weber's eventual confession, he had been a 24-year-old low-level associate in his father's drug operation when Thomas Chambers unwittingly photographed their colleagues unloading marijuana at Bayview Harbor. The organization quickly identified him through his vehicle's license plate, which was visible in the marina parking lot. Melvin Gunderson, the night manager at the Oceanview, was indeed involved not as an active participant, but as a paid informant who alerted the smugglers when specific vehicles or people of interest checked into the motel. He had notified Weber's father immediately upon the Chambers family's arrival. Weber claimed that Raymond Holt and another man named Patrick Donovan had confronted Thomas at the motel, threatening his family and demanding the camera. Thomas apparently surrendered the film, but claimed he had already mailed the camera to a colleague in Fresno as insurance. Whether this was true or a desperate attempt to create leverage for his family's safety remains unknown. "My job was just to follow them if they tried to leave," Weber stated. Holt and Donovan were in another car. "When the family pulled out of the motel, I tailed them while the other guys followed in a Chevy Blazer. About 5 miles north of town, they forced the station wagon off the road at a place called Black Rock Point." According to Weber, the confrontation turned violent when Thomas tried to escape with his family into the dense forest that borders that stretch of coastal highway. In the ensuing chaos, Weber claims he stayed with the vehicles while Holt and Donovan pursued the family on foot, carrying flashlights and firearms. "I heard shouting, then what sounded like gunshots, but it was windy that night, and the ocean was loud," Weber continued. "When they came back, maybe 30 minutes later, Holt just said, 'It's taken care of.' They told me to drive the station wagon back to the motel and park it exactly where it had been. Keys in the ignition, like the family had never left. Donovan followed in our car and picked me up." Weber insisted he never saw the bodies and didn't know exactly what had happened to the Chambers family during those 30 minutes. He claimed to have assumed at the time that they had been tied up or detained somewhere as a warning, only learning later, when the disappearance made the news, that the family had likely been killed. "I was in too deep by then," he said. "If I'd gone to the police, I'd have been next. My own father made that clear enough." Weber's confession, while revealing, still left crucial questions unanswered. Most pressing was the location of the family's remains. When pressed on this point, Weber claimed ignorance, suggesting that Holt and Donovan might have returned later to move the bodies, or that they might still be somewhere in the forest near Black Rock Point. An extensive search of the area began immediately, involving cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and dozens of officers combing the difficult terrain. The location presents significant challenges. Steep cliffs drop to the ocean on one side, while dense, old-growth forest covers the inland area, much of it overgrown with nearly impenetrable underbrush after 4 decades. Lloyd Weber was arrested and charged with 5 counts of kidnapping and as an accessory to murder, though the statute of limitations had expired on lesser charges like evidence tampering. His cooperation, while self-serving, provided the first solid leads on the Chambers family's fate since their disappearance. Patrick Donovan, the second man Weber implicated in the direct confrontation with the family, was discovered to have died in a boating accident off the coast of Mexico in 1989, with Raymond Holt having been killed in the 1984 shootout with DEA agents, and Lawrence Weber having succumbed to a heart attack in a federal prison in 1997 while serving time on unrelated drug trafficking charges. Lloyd Weber remained the only living person with direct knowledge of what happened that night. As the search at Black Rock Point continued into September 2024, another unexpected development occurred. An anonymous tip led investigators to a storage unit in Seattle that had been rented continuously since 1982 under the name Thomas Brown. When opened, the unit contained a single item, a metal safe deposit box. Inside the box, wrapped in acid-free paper that had preserved it remarkably well, was a handwritten letter dated July 16, 1981, the day before the Chambers family checked into the Oceanview Motel. The letter, verified by handwriting analysis to have been written by Thomas Chambers, was addressed to his brother Robert, who had died in 1993, never knowing of its existence. The contents of the letter shed new light on Thomas's state of mind and the events leading up to the family's disappearance. Rob, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. I have left this letter with instructions for it to be delivered to you if I don't return from our trip and make a specific phone call to cancel the delivery. I have stumbled onto something dangerous through work. The Coastal Express claim I was handling it wasn't just insurance fraud. I found evidence suggesting the company is a front for drug smuggling. When I reported my suspicions to Jack Reynolds at the FBI field office in Fresno, he asked me to help gather information during our vacation, as our route takes us through areas where they operate. I have agreed to take photos of specific locations along the coast, including a harbor in a town called Bayview, where Reynolds believes they bring shipments in. Eleanor doesn't know I told her it's for a special photography project. I don't want her worried. Reynolds assured me this is just information gathering. Completely safe, but I have a bad feeling. If we don't come back, tell the authorities to look into Coastal Express and Lloyd Weber, and tell them to check the film in my camera. I will hide it somewhere if things go bad. Take care of Mom if anything happens. You are a good brother. Love, Tom. This letter transformed understanding of the case once again. Thomas had not been a random tourist who stumbled upon criminal activity, nor a civilian who took it upon himself to investigate. He had been recruited as an informant by the FBI, sent deliberately into a dangerous situation with his unwitting family. The letter's reference to Jack Reynolds at the FBI field office in Fresno prompted an immediate internal investigation within the Bureau. No record of an agent by that name serving in Fresno during that period could be found. However, personnel files revealed that a John Rafferty had been stationed there from 1979 to 1982 before transferring to Washington, D.C., and eventually rising to a senior position before his retirement. When located and questioned at his home in Virginia, the now 78-year-old Rafferty initially denied any knowledge of Thomas Chambers or the case. Only when confronted with the letter did his demeanor change. After consulting with an attorney, Rafferty provided a limited statement, acknowledging that he had been involved in an investigation of coastal drug smuggling operations during that period, but claiming that any recruitment of civilian informants would have gone through proper channels with appropriate safeguards. Bureau records from the era, however, told a different story. A classified internal affairs investigation from 1982 had examined allegations that certain agents, including Rafferty, had improperly recruited civilian informants without adequate protection or oversight. The investigation had been closed without formal findings or disciplinary action, but Rafferty had been transferred shortly afterward. The implications were disturbing. Thomas Chambers might have been manipulated by an FBI agent operating outside proper protocols, sent with his family into the path of dangerous criminals without backup or protection. When things went wrong, it appeared the Bureau had covered up its involvement rather than launch a full-scale investigation that might have revealed its own misconduct. The level of institutional failure here is staggering, says former Detective Matthews, who came out of retirement to consult on the reinvigorated investigation. If the FBI had acknowledged their connection to Thomas back in 1981, resources could have been mobilized immediately. The family might have been found in time. Instead, crucial days were lost while local police tried to make sense of a seemingly random disappearance. The search at Black Rock Point intensified with this new information, now supported by additional federal resources. In October 2024, a breakthrough finally came. Approximately half a mile into the forest from the highway, cadaver dogs alerted to an area beneath a large fallen tree. Excavation revealed human remains that had been buried in a shallow grave. Initial forensic examination identified the remains as belonging to an adult male and female, along with two younger individuals. DNA testing was immediately ordered to confirm whether these were the remains of 4 members of the Chambers family. Notably absent were any remains that could belong to 9-year-old Daniel, the youngest child. This discovery aligned with a detail from Lloyd Weber's confession that investigators had initially dismissed. Weber had claimed to overhear Holt and Donovan arguing about the little one getting away when they returned to the vehicles that night. The possibility that Daniel Chambers might have escaped the initial confrontation and fled into the forest introduced both hope and heartbreak into the case. If the boy had survived the immediate attack, what had become of him? Could a 9-year-old have survived alone in the dense coastal wilderness? Might he have been found by someone else and perhaps traumatized and unable to identify himself, given a new identity? An age-progressed image of what Daniel might look like at 52 was quickly created and distributed nationwide. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added the case to their database of long-term missing children, and DNA from the partial remains recovered at the burial site was used to create a genetic profile that could identify Daniel or his descendants if they ever entered a commercial or law enforcement database. As investigators awaited final confirmation of the identities of the remains, the search for Daniel Chambers or evidence of his fate continued throughout the forests and communities surrounding Black Rock Point. The discovery of a child's shoe similar to the one found at Bayview Harbor in 1981, now heavily decomposed but with traces of what might be the same dinosaur drawing on the insole, suggested that Daniel had indeed fled toward the coast rather than inland. The most likely scenario, given the evidence, is that Daniel escaped during the initial confrontation and tried to find help by following the sound of the ocean, explains Nichols. If he reached the shoreline in the dark, disoriented and frightened, he might have fallen from the cliffs or been swept away by the tide. The shoe washing up in Bayview Harbor, weeks later, supports this theory. Yet without definitive evidence of Daniel's fate, the possibility that he somehow survived could not be completely discounted. Records of unidentified children entering foster care or medical facilities within a 200-mile radius during the months following July 1981 were being carefully reviewed. Missing person reports from subsequent years were re-examined for any individuals who might match Daniel's description or circumstances. By November 2024, DNA testing confirmed that the remains found at Black Rock Point belonged to Thomas, Eleanor, Michael, and Stephanie Chambers. Their cause of death appeared to be gunshot wounds, consistent with the shots Lloyd Weber claimed to have heard that night. After 43 years, the family would finally receive a proper burial, with arrangements being made by distant relatives who had never abandoned hope of finding answers. Lloyd Weber pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation and testimony. Now in poor health himself, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated for his role in the tragedy. The FBI formally acknowledged its historical connection to the case, issuing a carefully worded statement expressing regret for procedural oversights that may have contributed to the family's vulnerability. John Rafferty, the agent who had recruited Thomas, declined further comment through his attorney, though internal disciplinary proceedings were reportedly initiated to determine whether his pension benefits should be revoked based on his actions. The case, while technically solved, left a profound sense of incompleteness with the fate of Daniel Chambers still undetermined. The discovery of the camera in 2005 had provided the why of the family's disappearance. Howard Mercer's deathbed confession and Lloyd Weber's subsequent testimony had revealed the how, but the full extent of what had happened to the youngest son remained elusive. For Detective Nichols, the mystery of Daniel Chambers represented both the most tragic and most hopeful aspect of the case. Most likely he died that night or in the days that followed, alone and afraid in a strange place, she acknowledges. But until we have definitive proof, we have to consider the possibility, however remote, that he survived. As 2024 drew to a close, the search for answers about Daniel continued. Investigators pursued two parallel paths, searching for physical evidence of his death near Blackrock Point in the surrounding coastline, while simultaneously investigating any living persons who might match his profile or circumstances. The Chambers case had evolved from a baffling disappearance to a tragic story of a family unwittingly drawn into dangerous circumstances, betrayed by those meant to protect them, and ultimately destroyed by the collision of drug trafficking, institutional misconduct, and the cruel randomness of fate. Yet one final question lingered, pushing the investigation into its 44th year. What really happened to Daniel Chambers after he fled into the darkness on that July night in 1981? Did he survive against impossible odds, perhaps living a life with no memory of his true identity? Or did the sea claim him, as it had apparently claimed all evidence of his fate except for a single tennis shoe with a child's drawing inside? The answer to that question would lead investigators to the most shocking revelation, yet one that would reverberate through the halls of power and challenge the very foundations of the case they thought they had finally solved. The search for Daniel Chambers intensified through the winter of 2024 and into the spring of 2025. As the investigation approached its 44th anniversary, it had transformed from a cold case into one of the most actively pursued mysteries in Oregon's criminal history, with resources from local, state, and federal agencies devoted to resolving the final unanswered question: what had happened to the 9-year-old boy who disappeared that July night in... The prevailing theory that Daniel had fled toward the coastline and perished either from exposure or by falling from the cliffs guided the primary search efforts. Teams of forensic anthropologists systematically examined the rugged terrain between Blackrock Point and the ocean, using ground-penetrating radar and specialized equipment to detect any human remains that might have been overlooked in previous searches. Marine biologists and oceanographers were consulted to model the coastal currents from that summer in 1981, tracing possible paths that might have carried a body or evidence such as clothing or personal effects along the shoreline. This analysis suggested that if Daniel had entered the water near Blackrock Point, the prevailing currents would likely have carried anything floating southward, potentially explaining why his shoe had eventually washed up at Bayview Harbor, approximately 12 miles down the coast. In March 2025, this methodical approach yielded a significant discovery. During a low spring tide that exposed rarely accessible sea caves and recesses along the base of the cliffs, a search team located fragments of cloth wedged into a narrow fissure, approximately 20 feet above the normal waterline, a position that suggested they had been deposited during a severe storm surge, possibly decades earlier. The fabric fragments, though heavily degraded by exposure to salt water and weather, were determined to be consistent with children's pajamas manufactured in the late. More specifically, textile experts identified a pattern that matched the description of the pajamas Daniel had been wearing when the family fled the Motel Blue with small red sailboats. Mitochondrial DNA testing of the fibers confirmed the connection to the Chambers family through maternal lineage markers shared with the remains already identified as Eleanor Chambers. This discovery strongly supports our theory about Daniel's fate. Detective Nichols stated during a press briefing in April, the location of these fabric remnants, combined with the oceanographic analysis and the previous discovery of his shoe, creates a consistent narrative. Daniel fled toward the ocean, likely fell from the cliffs during the darkness, and his remains were largely claimed by the sea. For many observers, this evidence offered a somber but necessary closure to the case. The Oregon State Police prepared to officially classify Daniel Chambers as deceased, allowing for a final amendment to the death certificates of the family and the addition of his name to the memorial that had been established following the identification of his parents and siblings. Yet even as these preparations were underway, a parallel investigation continued to examine a different, far less likely possibility that Daniel had somehow survived that night. This avenue of inquiry, led by FBI Special Agent Teresa Hammond, methodically explored cases of unidentified children who had entered the social services system in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California during the months following the family's disappearance. Standard procedure in any long-term missing child case. Hammond explained, no matter how compelling the evidence of death might be, we are obligated to eliminate the possibility, however remote, that the child might have survived and established a new identity, either voluntarily or through circumstances beyond their control. The search parameters focused on boys between the ages of 8 and 11 who had been found wandering, amnesiac or unable to identify themselves between July 1981 and January 1982. The initial database query returned 17 cases across the three-state region. 14 were quickly eliminated through existing records that confirmed their identities or circumstances inconsistent with Daniel's case. 3 cases remained that warranted deeper investigation. A boy found at a truck stop near Eugene, Oregon in August 1981 who could not or would not speak. A child discovered living alone in an abandoned hunting cabin in the Cascade Mountains in November 1981, and a young boy who had been admitted to a Seattle hospital in October 1981, suffering from exposure and exhibiting signs of traumatic amnesia. Of these, the Seattle case initially seemed the most promising. The boy, estimated to be around 9 or 10 years old, had been found by hikers on a beach near Olympia, Washington, approximately 200 miles north of Bayview. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished, with injuries suggesting he had been living outdoors for an extended period. Medical records indicated he could not recall his name or circumstances, speaking only in fragmented phrases that made little sense to hospital staff. However, this lead evaporated when Hammond located archived fingerprint cards that had been created for the boy during the original investigation into his identity. The prints, though taken from a child's smaller fingers, were clear enough for modern comparison technology to definitively rule out any match to the partial prints on file for Daniel Chambers, taken from items in the family's Fresno home after their disappearance. The Eugene case proved similarly disappointing. The silent boy found at the truck stop was eventually identified through dental records as Timothy Grant, a child who had been abducted from his home in Spokane 2 months earlier. He had been reunited with his family after a period of intensive therapy to address the trauma that had rendered him temporarily mute. This left only the case of the boy found in the abandoned hunting cabin, a case that had been poorly documented at the time and had never been definitively resolved. According to the sparse records available, a forestry worker conducting surveys in a remote area of the Cascade Range had discovered a child, estimated to be 8 to 10 years old, living alone in a dilapidated cabin, approximately 100 miles inland from the Oregon coast. The boy, described as small for his age, with brown hair and blue eyes, a general description matching Daniel Chambers, had reportedly been surviving on canned food left in the cabin's pantry and by foraging in the surrounding forest. When questioned, he had claimed his name was David, but could provide no last name or explanation for his presence in the isolated location. The record of what happened next was frustratingly incomplete. Notes in the file indicated the boy had been temporarily placed with a foster family in Portland, while authorities attempted to identify him, but the case seemed to have fallen through bureaucratic cracks. The final entry, dated January 14, 1982, simply stated, "Case transferred to federal jurisdiction per request. No further action required at state level." This unusual notation immediately raised red flags for Agent Hammond. Child welfare cases were rarely transferred to federal jurisdiction in the early 1980s, unless they involved interstate kidnapping or very specific circumstances. The timing, less than 6 months after the Chambers family disappearance, combined with the mysterious federal intervention, warranted deeper investigation. Hammond submitted a formal request to access sealed federal records related to the case, expecting a routine process that might take several weeks. Instead, she received a phone call the following day from Deputy Director Calvin Pierce of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. "I understand you are looking into a 1981 child welfare case from Oregon," Pierce said without preamble. "I need you to secure any physical evidence you have collected and report to my office in Washington immediately. This is now a priority 1 matter. Do not discuss this with anyone, including your supervisor or Detective Nichols." 48 hours later, Hammond found herself in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters, facing not only Deputy Director Pierce, but also representatives from the Department of Justice, and most surprisingly, an attorney from the National Security Division. "What you have stumbled onto goes far beyond a missing persons case," Pierce informed her. "The boy found in that cabin, the one you are tracking, became the subject of a classified program that operated outside normal protocols. Very few people know the full story, and we have gone to considerable lengths to keep it that way for over 40 years. According to the classified files Hammond was permitted to review during that meeting, the boy found in the cabin in November 1981 had indeed been Daniel Chambers. His discovery had coincided with an internal FBI investigation into Agent John Rafferty's unauthorized recruitment of Thomas Chambers as an informant, the same investigation that had been abruptly closed without formal findings. In what the public records didn't show, and what had been deliberately concealed, was that senior FBI officials, upon learning that a child matching Daniel's description had been found alive, had made the extraordinary decision to keep his survival secret, even from law enforcement agencies investigating his family's disappearance. It was justified at the time as protecting a critical witness and potential intelligence asset, Pierce explained, his expression grim. Daniel had seen the men who attacked his family. In the context of the larger drug trafficking investigation, he was considered essential to building cases against not just the local operators, but potentially their connections to international cartels and even foreign intelligence services that were suspected of involvement. The classified files revealed the full, disturbing extent of the deception. Rather than reunite Daniel with his extended family or acknowledge his survival publicly, the Bureau had created an entirely new identity for him. David Carson. He had been placed with a carefully selected foster family, a former FBI agent, and his wife, and relocated to the East Coast, where he was raised with no knowledge of his true identity or the fate of his family. The level of institutional misconduct was staggering. Medical records had been falsified to document a different blood type than Daniel's actual one, making any later attempt at identification more difficult. School records were created showing a fabricated history of previous education. Most disturbingly, the FBI had actively misdirected the original investigation, deliberately withholding information that might have led local authorities to question whether Daniel had survived. "They let us believe he was dead for 44 years, Hammond later remarked to Detective Nichols, after being authorized to share limited information about the discovery. They let his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, his cousins, they let them all go to their graves, never knowing that Daniel was alive and well, living under a different name on the other side of the country." The revelation raised profound legal and ethical questions that extended far beyond the Chambers case itself. Who had authorized such an extraordinary intervention? What legal authority had been claimed to effectively erase a child's identity and sever him from his remaining family? And perhaps most importantly, what had become of Daniel Chambers, now living as David Carson, apparently unaware of his true history? These questions led to what may be the most remarkable chapter in this already extraordinary case. In May 2025, a carefully orchestrated operation was set in motion. After extensive deliberation at the highest levels of the Justice Department and FBI, the decision was made to finally acknowledge the truth and attempt to make what amends were still possible after 44 years of deception. David Carson, born Daniel Chambers, was now a 53-year-old history professor at a prestigious university in Massachusetts. Married with 2 adult children of his own, he had built an accomplished academic career, focusing on 20th-century American political history. By all accounts, he had no memory of his early childhood before age 9, believing the story he had been told, that his biological parents had died in a car accident, and he had been adopted by the Carsons afterward. The task of approaching Carson fell to Agent Hammond and a specialized team including a forensic psychologist and a Justice Department attorney. On a warm spring morning, they arrived at his campus office, requesting a private conversation about a matter of historical significance related to his academic expertise, a pretext designed to avoid triggering immediate alarm. What followed was a carefully structured disclosure process, beginning with general questions about Carson's knowledge of his own background and gradually introducing elements of the truth, supported by documentation and evidence that established beyond doubt his true identity as Daniel Chambers. Carson's initial reaction was understandably one of disbelief and anger. "This is either a cruel joke or some kind of elaborate mistake," he reportedly stated during that first meeting. "I would remember if I had witnessed my family being murdered. I would know if my entire life was a fabrication." Yet, as the evidence mounted DNA comparisons with the remains of his family members, photographs showing the striking resemblance between his own children and the grandparents they had never known existed, and most convincingly, a small, distinctive birthmark on his shoulder that matched medical records from Daniel Chambers' pediatrician in Fresno. The impossible truth became undeniable. "The human mind has remarkable protective mechanisms," explains Dr. Helen Forsyth, the forensic psychologist who assisted with the disclosure process. "Trauma in young children can lead to compartmentalization or even complete suppression of memories too painful to process. In Daniel's case, the combination of witnessing extreme violence, surviving alone in the wilderness for months, and then being given an entirely new identity and narrative about his past, it created the perfect conditions for what we would call targeted autobiographical amnesia." Over subsequent weeks, Carson, who has declined to publicly state whether he now identifies as Daniel Chambers, David Carson, or some combination of both, participated in a series of therapeutic sessions designed to explore whether recovery of his suppressed memories was possible or even advisable. In some cases, forced recovery of traumatic memories can do more harm than good, notes Dr. Forsyth. "Our primary concern was supporting him through the profound identity crisis this revelation inevitably triggered, while respecting his autonomy in deciding how much of his past he wished to reclaim." What emerged from these sessions was not the sudden, dramatic recovery of lost memories that might occur in fiction, but rather a more complex and gradual process of reconciliation between Carson's established identity and the newly revealed truth of his origins. "I have no conscious memory of being Daniel Chambers," Carson stated in his only public comment on the matter, released through his attorney. "The people I knew as my parents, the Carsons, raised me with love and care, and I have lived my entire adult life as David Carson. Yet I cannot ignore the evidence that I was born Daniel Chambers, that I had another family who loved me, and that through a series of tragic events and unconscionable decisions by government officials, that identity was taken from me. I am still processing what this means for me, for my understanding of myself, and for my family." The legal ramifications of the case quickly expanded beyond the original criminal investigation. In June 2025, Carson filed a civil lawsuit against the FBI and specific former officials, alleging violation of his constitutional rights, interference with family relationships, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, among other claims. The Justice Department, recognizing the indefensible nature of the Bureau's historical actions, signaled openness to a significant settlement rather than litigating the case. Concurrently, a congressional investigation was launched into the classified program that had authorized Daniel's effective disappearance and the creation of his new identity. Initial hearings revealed that Operation Safeguard, as it was code-named, had operated from 1980 to 1987 and had potentially involved dozens of witnesses and informants who were given new identities outside the established witness protection program, with fewer legal safeguards and oversight mechanisms. Records related to Operation Safeguard had been deliberately compartmentalized, with knowledge restricted to a small circle of officials, most of whom were now deceased. The program appeared to have been disbanded following internal concerns about its legality and ethics, but its actions were never reviewed or remediated. Former FBI Director Anthony Morgan, who had held a mid-level position in the Bureau during the relevant period, testified that Operation Safeguard represented a profound institutional failure during a dark chapter of the Bureau's history, while acknowledging that such extraordinary measures were deemed necessary during the height of the drug wars of the early 90s. The decision to separate a child from his extended family and conceal his survival was indefensible, regardless of the perceived intelligence value. Morgan stated that such a decision could be made and implemented within a law enforcement agency sworn to uphold the Constitution, reflects a moral breakdown that we must acknowledge and ensure can never happen again. For those who had spent decades investigating the Chambers case, the revelations about Daniel's survival and the government's role in hiding it required a fundamental re-evaluation of everything they thought they knew. All those years searching for answers, and the biggest piece of the puzzle was deliberately kept from us by the very agencies supposedly helping with the investigation, reflects Detective Matthews, who had devoted much of his career to the case. It makes you question every other case where federal authorities were involved. What other secrets are buried in classified files? The implications extended beyond just this single case. The exposure of Operation Safeguard raised disturbing questions about potential similar interventions in other investigations, potentially affecting dozens of unresolved disappearances and cold cases from the same era. By July 2025, on the 44th anniversary of the original disappearance, a complex picture of what truly happened to the Chambers family had finally emerged, a narrative far more disturbing than even the most cynical observers had imagined. Thomas Chambers, an insurance adjuster with no law enforcement training, had been improperly recruited by FBI agent John Rafferty to gather intelligence on a drug smuggling operation during what was supposed to be a family vacation. When Thomas unwittingly photographed a drug delivery at Bayview Harbor, he and his family became targets of the traffickers, who had been tipped off by Melvin Gunderson, the motel's night manager. Warned of the immediate danger by an unidentified person, possibly a reluctant participant in the smuggling operation with a conscience about involving children, the family had fled in their station wagon, only to be pursued and forced off the road near Black Rock Point. In the ensuing confrontation, Thomas, Eleanor, and their two older children, Michael and Stephanie, were killed. 9-year-old Daniel escaped into the forest, eventually making his way to the abandoned hunting cabin, where he survived alone for nearly 4 months before being discovered. Rather than acknowledge the FBI's culpability in placing the family in danger through Rafferty's unauthorized recruitment, senior officials had made the extraordinary decision to conceal Daniel's survival and create an entirely new identity for him. Actions that effectively buried the truth for more than 4 decades. The physical evidence discovered in the sea cave in March 2025, fabric matching Daniel's pajamas, raised yet another disturbing possibility. Had evidence been deliberately planted over the years to support the narrative that Daniel had perished? The timing of the discovery, coming just as Agent Hammond was closing in on the truth about the boy found in the cabin, struck some observers as suspiciously convenient. When questioned about this possibility, Deputy Director Pierce would neither confirm nor deny that such evidence manipulation had occurred, saying only that the full extent of actions taken to maintain the operational security of Safeguard remains under investigation. For David Carson, formerly Daniel Chambers, the revelation of his true identity opened a door to family connections he never knew existed. DNA testing confirmed relationships with several cousins on both his mother's and father's sides, relatives who had grown up hearing about their missing family members, but never imagining that one of them was alive and well. Carson's decision to meet these newfound relatives marked one of the more poignant chapters in the story. In August 2025, he and his wife traveled to Fresno to meet with the extended Chambers family, including Eleanor's younger sister Catherine, now 78 and the only surviving sibling of either parent. "I don't remember her," Carson acknowledged in a brief statement following that meeting. "I don't remember any of them. But there was still something profoundly moving about sitting across from people who share my blood, who knew and loved the parents and siblings I lost. They showed me photographs of birthday parties I don't recall attending, told me stories about a mother whose face I can't picture, described a father whose voice I can't hear in my memory. Yet somehow these fragments have begun to fill a void I never knew existed." The lawsuit Carson filed against the federal government was settled in September 2025 for an undisclosed sum reported to be in excess of $30 million, a figure that, while substantial, could hardly compensate for the family connections, identity, and truth that had been stolen from him. As part of the settlement, the FBI agreed to create a special review panel to examine other cases potentially affected by Operation Safeguard or similar classified interventions, with particular focus on missing persons cases that might have been deliberately left unresolved. Lloyd Weber, whose confession had helped break open the case but who had been unaware of Daniel's survival, received a modified sentence in recognition of his cooperation. Patrick Donovan and Raymond Holt, the men directly responsible for killing 4 members of the Chambers family, had died decades earlier without facing justice for their crimes. John Rafferty, the FBI agent who had improperly recruited Thomas Chambers, was stripped of his pension benefits and faced potential criminal charges for his role in falsifying federal records related to the case. His attorney indicated that Rafferty would cooperate fully with investigations, attributing his actions to misguided priorities during an era when the war on drugs overshadowed constitutional considerations. For the town of Bayview, the resolution of the case brought closure to a mystery that had shaped local identity for nearly half a century. The Bayview Boutique Hotel, built on the site of the former Oceanview Motel, installed a small memorial plaque commemorating the Chambers family. The annual tourism brochures, which had long featured subtle references to Oregon's most famous disappearance, were rewritten to focus instead on the natural beauty of the coastline and the resilience of the community. Yet for many, particularly those in law enforcement, the Chambers case left a legacy of institutional distrust that would be difficult to overcome. The revelation that federal agencies had deliberately concealed the truth for decades, allowing a false narrative to persist even as dedicated investigators devoted their careers to solving the case, struck at the foundation of interagency cooperation and public confidence in the justice system. How do we move forward from here? Detective Nichols asked during the final press conference announcing the case's resolution. How do we tell families of missing persons that we are doing everything possible to find their loved ones, when this case shows that the truth might be hidden not just by criminals, but by the very institutions charged with uncovering it? For David Carson, the journey of reconciling his established identity with his newly discovered origins continues. He has returned to teaching, incorporating elements of his own extraordinary story into discussions about government overreach and the ethics of national security decisions. His children, technically the grandchildren of Thomas and Eleanor Chambers, have embraced their expanded family history, forming relationships with their newfound relatives and helping to bridge the 44-year gap created by governmental deception. In October 2025, Carson published a brief memoir titled The Boy in the Cabin, addressing his unique experience of discovering his true identity in middle age. In it he writes, "I exist in a strange liminal space between 2 lives, the one taken from me, which I cannot remember but now know was mine, and the one given to me which shaped me into the person I am today. I cannot untangle these threads of identity, nor would I wish to. Daniel Chambers and David Carson are both me and not me, both real and constructed. The tragedy is not just what happened to my first family, but that I was never allowed to choose how to integrate these 2 realities until now, when I am older than my parents were when they died." The Chambers case, with its final astonishing twist, has taken its place among America's most extraordinary criminal investigations, a story of family tragedy, governmental misconduct, and the resilience of a child who survived unimaginable trauma, even as the memory of that trauma was buried so deeply that it took 44 years to unearth. The camera discovered in the motel wall in 2005 had indeed been the key that eventually unlocked the mystery, though not in the way anyone could have predicted. The photographs it contained had not only revealed why the family was targeted, but had set in motion the chain of investigations that ultimately led to the truth about Daniel's survival. In a final symbolic gesture, Carson donated the camera, now an artifact of both personal and historical significance, to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where it is displayed in an exhibit on law enforcement, privacy, and the limits of governmental authority. Beside it rests a simple placard that reads, "This camera, hidden by Thomas Chambers moments before his family was forced to flee their motel room in July, contained evidence that would eventually reveal one of the most complex and disturbing cases in American criminal history. A case that reminds us that the search for truth is sacred, that family bonds transcend even the most elaborate deception, and that no power granted to government should ever supersede the fundamental right of a child to know who they are and where they come from." For the town of Bayview, for the investigators who devoted their careers to the case, for the extended Chambers family who never stopped wondering what happened to their loved ones, and for David Carson, once Daniel Chambers, the mystery that began on a summer night in 1981 has finally been laid to rest, though its implications continue to resonate through American law enforcement, government accountability, and our understanding of the delicate, sometimes fragile nature of identity itself. The case of the vacationing family that vanished from the Oceanview Motel in 1981 is closed, but the questions it raises about trust, truth, and the limits of power will remain open for generations to come.